Good afternoon. So what I'm interested in is the period covering the MSA to the LSA transition, and this has attracted quite a lot of attention lately amongst archaeologists, certainly because of its relevance to models concerning the recent dispersal of modern humans, or Homo sapiens I should say, out of Africa at 60,000 years ago, as well as the proposed subsequent backflow of humans into Africa. So studies, as we know, of mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, especially U6, have provided an estimated age of about 35,000 years ago, according to the latest publications, for the back migration of modern humans to North Africa. But there's a great deal of uncertainty over the timing, and in any case, as we know, the relationship between demographic and genetic histories is very unclear, and the effects on cultural change can only really be surmised. And indeed, cultural reproduction and change may have been the result of multiple processes, as summarized here, through cultural inheritance and spread, through cultural diffusion between populations, or indeed through independent reinvention. So in this talk, I want to take a closer look at the archaeological evidence for the cultural transition from the Middle Stone Age to the Later Stone Age in North Africa, and specifically the Maghreb region of Northwest Africa. As you can see here, that is Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Western Libya. And really to review the latest information on dating and environmental evidence, and at the same time to examine what this might mean in terms of population history for the region. Now, traditionally, a very simplified picture has been put forward of two dominant techno-complexes, the MSA Aterian, shown here on the top, a Leverhulme technology with Tang tools, followed by the LSA Eberomaurusian in the lower register, which is dominated by bladelet technology and including microliths, with a long break in occupation between them. But in fact, if we look at this simple twofold division into flake and bladelet industries, this actually ignores the fact that small blades and bladelets can occur in the Aterian, in the MSA, and indeed we know that in the Eberomaurusian, the LSA in Northwest Africa, we don't always see typical microliths. And of course, we also know that microliths can occur, microlithic points can occur in the MSA, for example, here in the Howisson's Put. So to investigate some of these issues, particularly to produce a clearer understanding of the chronology, we have been excavating the site of Tafouralt here in Morocco over the last decade, where there is a very long sequence of Aterian deposits overlain by the Eberomaurusian. And here is the site, as you can see, indicated, and a little car in the car park indicates it's quite a large cave opening. Now, the MSA Aterian deposits are made up of very well-defined artifact layers rich in hearths that date back over 90,000 years ago now. But near the front of the cave, we have a younger part of the sequence preserved, where the MSA layers have been sealed by a series of rock falls. You can see these indicated here, these very rich hearth deposits of the MSA. The younger MSA deposits, the younger units, first of all, the dating. So the dating here is still in its early stages, but we have a good concordance between AMS radiocarbon and TL ages on burnt stone artifacts of 27,000 years ago. And these are now the youngest ages that have been recorded for the MSA in North Africa. And below this is a much longer sequence, or a deeply buried sequence of further MSA hearth deposits that we are continuing to investigate. Now these deposits just below the rockfall, the MSA, are very interesting for a number of reasons, but particularly they contain very well preserved charred plant remains and charcoal recovered through wet sieving and flotation. And this makes the site very exceptional, and is now one of a handful of sites in the Mediterranean of this age, certainly, that have produced very large quantities of charred plant remains. The most significant taxa recovered are legumes consisting of lentil, vetch, and pulses, and these produce edible seeds rich in carbohydrates and proteins. And we assume that they were harvested for food, since there is a long tradition of consuming these plants in the Mediterranean today. Also present in the charred residues are examples of lotus fruit, which is still commonly eaten in Morocco today, and another plant that's present in large quantities are the residues of alpha grass. And today we know this is used for a whole range of things, used in basketry and matting, and even for making nets and sandals, as you can see here. So what about the archaeology? Well, the lithic artifacts within these hearth layers are typically Middle Stone Age, with a high incidence of Leverhulme technique, and dominated by side scrapers and denticulates, but with no Aterian points. Immediately above the rock falls, though, there is a marked change in technology, with the appearance of a non-Leverhulme flake industry, including large adzes or axes greater than 10 centimetres in length. And these are so far typologically without precedent in the Maghreb. We find them nowhere else in the Maghreb, and of course they may represent a purely local tradition. They're also accompanied by small numbers of other tools, such as side scrapers, but the most prominently we find very large quantities of thinning flakes from the manufacture, presumably of the adzes. And the artifacts are made in quartzite and volcanic tuff, and occur in the same layer in various parts across the site, in various areas of the site. So it's not simply a very localized activity. Now, just above this non-Leverhulme flake industry, which is shown at the bottom here, are is a great thickness of 3.5 to 4 meters thickness of LSA deposits that cover this non-Leverhulme industry, and these have now been very well dated, with over 50 AMS radiocarbon dates on charcoal and some on bone from Oxford, and they produce a very coherent picture with a slight gap in between this non-Leverhulme flake industry and the Eberomaurusian, which is indicated by the IB, and we've separated them into 3 phases, IB 1, 2 and 3. And this major change in technology now is shown by the presence of large numbers of bladelets struck from bladelet cores, and very often having this distinctive what's called uchtata retouch, which is a marginal retouch on one of the lateral edges. And as we go up the sequence, we see a progression in the development of all sorts of different microlith points, right up to the very top of our particular sequence, where we have, again, a high dominance of these microliths made on bladelets. We also know that in the LSA, in this Eberomaurusian, there is a very widespread use of plants, but this time the most important, certainly from the residues, the most important plants that we find are things like sweet acorn and pine nuts, and these were consumed in very large numbers, as published in a paper in PNAS by Humphrey et al. So one of the things that we've been doing as well, recently with my research student Josh Hogue and we've been reviewing the distribution of the LSA, Eberomaurusian find spots in the Maghreb. And although they follow a largely coastal pattern, in fact, we can now add many more sites further inland, showing the widespread nature of this technology. Looking at the broader geographical picture, identical LSA microlithic bladelet technologies are present all the way along the North African littoral zone, stretching from the Haaftea over in Libya all the way over to sites in western Morocco. And this has led in the past, I think, to the speculation of cultural diffusion along the Mediterranean coast. And of course this fits the phylogenetic models of backflow of humans into North Africa from the Levant. But to see if the dating evidence matched this expectation, we restudied the sequence at Tamar Hat. This is the site just here in Algeria between Tafouralt and the Haaftea, to look at the dating evidence from this site for the LSA. Now, this was a site previously excavated by Earl Saxon in the 1960s and 70s, and we were able to select cut-marked bones from the main archaeological horizons for AMS dating. The dates shown on the right-hand side are actually broadly in line with Saxon's original estimates, but these were all based on bulk radiocarbon samples of charcoal. But nevertheless, we've seen now an even earlier age for the beginning of the LSA at this site of around 21,000 years ago. So putting the known dates together, this doesn't seem to support a simple diffusion model of a spread of the LSA bladelet technology westwards along the coast. And indeed, one could make an argument for the earliest dates being here in Algeria and maybe spreading in more than one direction, if you want to use the dates in that way. Now, the Haaftea, I just want to draw attention to that in Libya. It's a very interesting site, as we all know, but it's interesting particularly because of its LSA deposits in terms of this argument. And one of the things that we can see is the cultural sequence here shows that the microlithic bladelet technologies, they developed a little later, as I said, than they did in the Maghreb, but also that the Eberomaurusian, which is known locally here as the Eastern Iranian, here at the top, it lies immediately above the Daban technology, which contains blades and bladelets, shown here. Now, the cultural sequence, the layers at this site are well dated. They rely on radiometric determinations, but also now by a series of dated cryptotephoras. And you can see that these show this division between a Mousterian, an early and late Daban, and an Eberomaurusian. And the divisions here you can see in terms of the ages mentioned. But the key point from my perspective is that it shows a totally different development than we find in the Maghreb. In the Maghreb, there is no evidence of the Daban. So, to summarize all of this, we can show that the MSA certainly is much younger in northwest Africa than previously thought, going back to 27,000 years or maybe younger, uncalibrated. And also that there is these are associated with habitats that were very rich in edible plant remains, and also that there is a much narrower gap between the MSA and the LSA than was previously suspected. And it's possible that this is beginning to be filled up with other forms of archaeological evidence and possible transitional stages, like this curious layer with axes and adzes dating to about 22,000 years ago and not very far in age from the earliest LSA from Tamar Hat. And finally, I think it's very clear, and it may well have been clear to people working in sub-Saharan Africa, but it seems very clear to us in North Africa that the transition was not a simple or uniform process, even at a local or at regional scales. And although the case for continuity in the Maghreb still has to be made, it now appears likely, at least in our view, that the microlithic bladelet industries emerged via different paths in the Maghreb and the Libyan uplands. So just to acknowledge funding and all my collaborators. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. We have plenty of time for plenty of questions.
There'll be no questions. Thomas.
Yes, my question is, what do you expect that the LGM has impact on these transitions, because the dates fit well to this LGM phase?
Yeah, we speculated in a paper in JHE published a few years ago that this really was possibly an important aspect of the argument. The difficulty is that we have very little environmental evidence from that period of the LGM, and according to some of the proxy data from, for example, the Mediterranean sea cores and some of the pollen evidence, it does appear to be a slightly drier period, but it doesn't necessarily, it wasn't, to my mind, it can't be the sole explanation. I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, that there is some population or some other change going on at that time, but whether there is an environmental pulse that leads to this, I'm still very hesitant to say.
Any input from the north?
From the north, meaning across the Mediterranean. Well, it brings a very interesting speculation, which shows an old idea originally put forward in the 1960s, which was that we should really be looking perhaps at a reverse migration to today from Italy over to areas of Tunisia and Algeria, and it's certainly possible that there may be a link between the epigravettian, which is a bladelet industry, in places like Italy, but there's no absolute evidence, except slightly later on there's movement between Tunisia and certainly some of the Italian islands for collecting obsidian. But no, there's no absolute evidence linking either across the Gibraltar Strait or across the strait between Sicily and Tunisia. But there's a huge submerged landscape that we just know very, very little about, that is now submerged off the coast of Tunisia. So we don't know very much about the archaeology in those areas.
Okay, two more quick questions. Daniel.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. You mentioned the MSA Ethereum and the MSA with tanks. Is that somehow still holding up, or what you're thinking about in the difference of that, or what is the current state?
I wish my colleague Jalil Bouzagar was here, because I think he would have a very strong view on this. His idea is that the Ethereum continues right the way through, and it's basically just a general name for the MSA, and sometimes it has tanged points and sometimes it doesn't. All I can say is it's very much dominated by Leverhulme technology, and when we see that technology disappearing, there is obviously some sort of choice that's been made by the people. And so to my mind, you know, it's simpler sort of to bulk things together in these large units for the moment until we can break them down. But no, it's still a big problem. What exactly is the Ethereum? But that's maybe for another conference.
And the last one? Sorry.
Yes, I would like to add one argument on the mitochondrial DNA evidence, another genetical argument, which is the fact that the Maghreb, North Africa, is today one region of Africa where we do find Neanderthal signal in the modern genome. And the most parsimonious way to interpret that is that the area has been repeopled sometime after the integration of the Neanderthal DNA into modern genome from Eurasia. So that's consistent with the idea that there is an influx of population in North Africa coming from somewhere, Italy or the Levant or anywhere, but bringing into Africa this signal.
And what sort of age would you put on that?
Oh, I mean, we cannot put an age on that, but we can just say that it has to postdate the integration of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans after the last, the main out of Africa movement. So it's somewhere between what we call hyperbarotic. It's somewhere in the stage 3 or something like that. So it would fit with the notion that these guys and these industries are sort of immigrants.